Good morning, everyone. My name is Mikaela Rambali, and I work in the Resilience, Adaptation and Water team of the Environment Directorate. And thank you very much for having me today to discuss this topic with you all. I'm pleased to present to you this report that we released this year, and among which I was among the main authors. So my presentation, I'll dive right into the topic, and I'll start my presentation by explaining to you how we frame the concept of nature-based solution within the OECD. As you may already know, this term, nature-based solution, can be seen as an umbrella concept that covers many interventions. And the definition we use at the OECD, which is not universal, is the following. And so NBS, nature-based solutions, are measures that can protect, sustainably manage, or restore nature. And these are measures that are aimed to maintain or enhance ecosystem services to address a societal challenge. So while there are many definitions out there, we really emphasize on this ultimate objective to address a societal challenge, which could be biodiversity loss, climate change mitigation, or in the case of the work we've been doing at the OECD, it's really about climate change adaptation. And so the work that we have done has looked at the role of NBS to address water-related climate risks, such as riverine or urban or coastal flooding, as well as drought and erosion. So we also undertook work on coastal areas in which we look at how some NBS can address coastal flooding to provide some buffer zone so countries can, for instance, restore wetland or introduce vegetation along the shoreline to reduce the wave heights or stabilize the shoreline in case of storm or extreme weather events. And so for decades or even centuries, NBS have really proven their role to address water-related risks. And there's a growing evidence of their potential to adapt to growing climate risks. They can be used in complement to or instead of gray infrastructure. And this is because the growing attention is also because they tend to perform quite well over a range of geographic and climate conditions and provide many socioeconomic and environmental benefits, many of examples of which you'll find in our work. And as a result of this, there's growing international support for NBS, and they've been reflected in the Paris Agreement, in the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. They've also been made one of the priorities under the latest G20 presidency or in the upcoming COP. So last year, we published a policy paper that looked at the role of the policymakers and how they could overcome some of the challenges of NBS. And this policy paper really laid the ground for the report I'll present to you today. And it explored some of the definition of the NBS. It provided a number of examples of the socioeconomic as well as the environmental benefits of NBS. And also identified some of the challenges. So here they are listed in yellow on the slide, notably that there's generally low awareness of the use and the benefits of NBS. There's also a perception that they are too expensive or that they are difficult to implement, and that there's low evidence of their effectiveness. And so based on this finding, we developed a policy evaluation framework to support the countries in strengthening their enabling environment. And it covers 5 dimensions, which are listed here in the blue boxes. And I'll talk more about each one of them in how we apply this policy framework in our latest report. And the report I present really builds on 2 country case study we did on Mexico and the United Kingdom. So the examples I will bring up will mostly focus on them. And this report was really to improve our understanding of some of the challenges that were faced by policymakers and practitioners to scale up the use of NBS, and also try to identify an attempt to identify ways and good practices to foster NBS in places where they provide both effective and cost-efficient alternative or complement to grey infrastructure. So I'll go through each of the components, started with governance arrangement, which is a key topic today. And it's a core element of this enabling environment, because NBS are really complex to plan and to implement, because they bring many stakeholders together who have different roles to play over the lifetime of the NBS project, whether it can be to design or to monitor or to provide funding. And so in the work we've done at the country level, we noticed that the national government has a really key role to play to give this impulse to nature-based solution projects. And what we see is that there is often a strong push from the Ministry of Environment. So in the case of Mexico and UK, it was Semarnat and DEFRA who really pushed for designing and implementing NBS projects. There's also additional agencies that also contribute to these measures, whether directly under the oversight of the Ministry of Environment, such as water or forestry commissions in Mexico, or the Environment Agency in the UK. And there are also other sectoral actors that play a role, such as the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Interior as well. At the subnational level too, the authorities have a strong role to play to ensure that the solutions are adapted to the local context. And in the example of the UK, we found that the lead local flood authorities are responsible, given they're responsible for developing local flood strategies in the UK, they have a key role to implement the NBS measures. NBS measures also integrate and need the support from non-government actors, whether it's private actors such as water utilities, who can include NBS in their operation, but as well NGOs or local communities can have a key role to play with regards to the implementation, or as well in the monitoring of the NBS. They can also, all these actors can come together to share information, but there are also other ways that they can collaborate, notably through the use of certain policy instruments. For instance, the government can mobilize private actors and engage with them in land stewardship scheme to make sure that they are and fund and incentivize them to undertake an NBS action. And there are also other mechanisms such as local planning tools making NBS eligible for certain funding streams, who can thereby engage with other and make sure that other people are engaged in the project. The second key area of our policy evaluation framework is policies. We found that there's quite strong support at the domestic level via policies to support NBS, notably in these two countries, where NBS are increasingly integrated in high-level policies, notably for policies that relate to environment. So there's a number of countries that reflect a nature-based solution in their nationally determined contribution, so NDCs, as a way to achieve their either climate change mitigation or climate change adaptation objectives. We also did a scan of at the time 35 OECD countries that had national adaptation plans, so NAPs, and found that 24 of them explicitly encouraged the use of NBS. And among the water-related risks they look into in the NAPs, urban flooding was referenced most frequently. For example, Mexico refers to the potential of NBS to address coastal hazards or riverine flooding. And the UK uses and references NBS to address urban flooding. There are also policies related to biodiversity that refer to NBS, but in this case, it underlines a bit more the biodiversity benefits from this action. And this is in Mexico's national biodiversity strategy, or the UK environment build as well, include underline these opportunities. water policies too address NBS whether at national level or more local level, especially for flood and drought management. In the UK, the National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy really emphasizes on the use of what they call natural flood management approaches, which are a type of NBS. And they underline that they should be used when appropriate, and notably through restoring floodplains or making sure that the government implements sustainable urban drainage system to avoid these type of so notably flood risks. There are also NBS that can be found at the sectoral policies. For instance, the UK Agricultural Act includes measures to pay landowners to enhance ecosystem services. And also at the national, the subnational level, where there are measures such as local adaptation plans that include NBS to support their benefits at the local level. Regulatory requirements are another way to facilitate or hinder and discourage the use of NBS. And both planning frameworks or regulatory requirements can do so. In some countries, there are land use planning frameworks that are really starting to prioritize the use of nature-based solutions. In the UK, they developed this policy planning framework, which provides a good example that encourages authorities to maintain and enhance green infrastructure. And similarly, in Norway, municipalities are required to consider NBS in their planning processes before actually opting for grey infrastructure as an alternative. So they need to justify if they do not proceed with an NBS, why they are not doing so. Some requirements through building codes and other regulation are really also considered more and more to encourage the use of NBS. For example, a number of cities are now requiring that new buildings above a certain threshold have a green roof, and this can facilitate water flow in case of heavy rains, and this is the case in Toronto, Copenhagen, or London. And finally, there's also the scope to better use procurement processes to create opportunities for NBS. But however, we find that this hasn't been used so far as much as it could be, because there are difficulties in demonstrating the socioeconomic and environmental benefits, which really makes it hard for practitioners to fit NBS in the traditional processes and procurement processes. Which leads me to my fourth component of the policy evaluation framework, which is technical capacity. Actors really need to have a strong and robust information base to design and implement NBS. And this is a way to facilitate and support decision making to make sure and to determine whether an NBS would be appropriate in a specific context. And countries have made efforts to improve, for instance, the ecosystem evaluation assessment and to better quantify the benefits of NBS. And this is what the UK has done with the national ecosystem assessment to do an inventory of existing natural capital. And I'm pleased to see that you'll be discussing this a bit more later today. Another way is also to improve and facilitate the use of and access to tools, guidance, best practices that can help technical capacity and build technical capacity among policymakers and practitioners. For instance, the UK created an evidence directorate that compiles case studies and best practices. The EU, at the EU level, there's also several websites that compile case studies and best practices, like the Urban Nature Atlas. Some countries have also developed technical guidance, for instance, that are allocated to specific sectors. In the UK, the construction industry has developed a focus on sustainable urban drainage system. And finally, there are also some educational programs that have been promoted and created. For example, at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, there's now also an engineering program that teaches students about their green infrastructure. Finally, the last and fifth component of our policy evaluation framework looks at a funding and finance mechanism. Public funding is generally the largest source of funding that is available for NBS, and it's usually provided in form of grants. In Mexico, there's public funding that can come from different funds, such as those that are specific to biodiversity, which is called ProRest. And in the UK, there's also the Nature for Climate Fund and or the Flood and Coastal Resilience Innovation Program, which are funding mechanism specifically to promote. That includes not specifically to NBS, but that includes and covers NBS auction. Then in the interviewees we engaged with to undertake this case study also noted that the funding landscape was quite scattered across the environment and climate funds, as well as disaster risk management fund. And that sometimes the public funding is supplemented by funding from either from NGOs, from philanthropies, communities or businesses, such as property developers or water companies, which creates some challenges for practitioners to access the fund and navigate all of these funds. And finally, the private actors who are engaged on, which is another source of funding, and they play an important role in implementing or in funding NBS, is at this stage quite limited in the case of addressing water-related climate risk. And that's why the public funding usually step in to mobilize additional private finance. And governments are incentivizing private actors. So at the small scale, it could be landowners, farmers, or foresters to implement NBS initiatives on private lands through their own schemes. For example, the UK Investment Readiness Fund is an example that aims to prepare NBS initiatives as pilot project, and that could potentially be suitable for commercial investment afterwards. Private actors such as water utilities are also using some proceeds from the grants or other range of instruments to fund NBS, notably for water tariffs. And there are some examples of these in the UK, but again, it's quite limited in the case of water-related climate risks. So finally, to conclude, with that, I'll present some of the challenges and opportunities that emerge from our analysis. In terms of governance arrangement, we showed that it was quite complex and that the NBS could both hinder and facilitate the uptake of NBS. And these challenges often stem from the fact that there are a large number of actors and their roles and responsibility over NBS initiatives may differ. And when we undertook the study, the stakeholder actually pointed out that the large number of actors actually led them to work in isolation and could possibly limit the sense of ownership and accountability over the NBS project. And that was an issue that came out several times, notably concerning the legal complexity related to land ownership or liability, notably over the long term, for instance, and notably landowners were concerned over the liability or over potential maintenance of the NBS initiative, which would need to be maintained for its benefit to be sustained in the long term. So therefore, we suggest to continue facilitating collaboration and engagement with relevant stakeholders to make the most of the multidisciplinarity of NBS initiatives. And this will then be important to help raise awareness and strengthen the understanding of NBS, but also improve the coherence across sectors, including creating synergies and avoiding possible trade-off between different sectors. and increase the ownership and accountability through the clarification of this complexity related to land ownership and liability over the long term. In policy, so we see that there's growing support at the domestic level, but we see that there are actually, when you dig a bit more into the policies, you see that there are very few contain quantitative targets or requirements for monitoring and evaluation of the policies over the long term, and making sure that the policy achieved the goals that they had set for themselves. And we find that there's actually scope to also better integrate NBS in other sectors, be it agriculture or tourism as well, because there are also trade-offs that could arise from undertaking NBS. And it's important to make them and take them into consideration. For example, an agricultural land, such as a floodplain, can result in reduced agricultural output. So it's important for governments to address these conflicting trade-offs to make sure that the policy objectives are achieved. We've highlighted some of the good practices that emerge in integrating NBS in spatial planning and in building codes. However, and while we think that regulation can really unleash the potential of NBS, this could only happen if there are better tools and guidelines that can actually demonstrate the benefits of NBS. And this is particularly true in the case of procurement processes. In terms of technical capacity, although countries are making good efforts to improve the information base, there's still a big gap to bridge to ensure that there's solid and relevant information base that can underpin the decision making, and that there's also better information related to the effectiveness of NBS, notably through the long term, because often monitoring and evaluation is not incorporated in NBS project over the life cycle, which is actually critical to encourage their future uptake. So this is why we encourage countries to continue raising awareness and build solid technical capacity for policymakers across level of governments as well as practitioners. And finally, last but not least, there are a few challenges that emerge on the finance side. So the difficulty of accessing funding was one of them. Practitioners flagged that NBS are still not always eligible for pools of funding, and that are usually traditionally designed to support grey infrastructure. Interestingly, Canada has just developed a new disaster mitigation and adaptation fund that makes NBS available and eligible for this fund. Another difficulty is the difficulty to secure and the funding over the project life cycle, which would cover monitoring and maintenance. And this is usually not, the practitioner flag that usually this is not factored in initial budget, which is a challenge that countries need to overcome. Another one that we need to continue make a strong business case for NBS, because at this stage, the private sector participation is still limited. So this is why we encourage countries to enhance access to funding and to continue trying to leverage the private contribution via the use of incentives. And so this was one of our main reports. And you'll find some of the challenges and the messages that were highlighted here today in our policy paper that was published in 2020. We also lastly published a report that looks at how NBS can foster adaptation and mitigation linkages, and how government can use them to address both policy agendas, and looking also and considering the possible trade-off that emerge from these. And the report I presented to you includes 2 case studies as well as an overview chapter. And we're continuing to do country-focused work, notably in Hungary, to enlarge the scope in terms of experience in managing other risk and at different levels. So the work we're doing now is at a municipality level. And I hope the presentation to you today gave you some insight for your own work and highlighted some of the gaps that could perhaps resonate in your own work and own context. So I thank you, Maria, for the invitation and the organizer for convening me to this meeting, and wish you all a very fruitful discussion over the course of the day.